The needle slipped through Eleanor's finger for the third time that evening, and she pressed her thumb against the bead of blood before it could stain the cream-colored fabric stretched across her lap. The fabric that bore his name in careful, secretive stitches she worked on only when the boarding house fell silent after midnight. Eleanor Hartford had arrived in Banner Creek, Wyoming Territory, 6 months earlier in the spring of 1876, fleeing a life in Philadelphia that had grown suffocating under her aunt's demands that she marry a banker twice her age with hands like dead fish. At 22 years old, she had taken her small inheritance from her mother and bought a ticket west, answering an advertisement for a seamstress position in a town she had never heard of, in a territory that promised freedom even if it also promised hardship. The boarding house where she rented a small room on the second floor sat on the edge of town, a sturdy structure built of pine logs and determination, run by a widow named Mrs. Callahan who asked few questions and expected prompt payment every Friday. The quilt had started innocently enough. Eleanor had been commissioned by the banker's wife, Mrs. Theodore Moss, to create a commemorative quilt for the town's 10th anniversary celebration in the fall. The design was to feature significant names from Banner Creek's history, all the founding families and prominent citizens stitched into squares of fabric that would hang in the new town hall once construction finished. Eleanor had accepted the commission eagerly, grateful for the work that would pay enough to see her through the winter months when sewing jobs grew scarce. But then she had met James Cooper. He had walked into Mrs. Patterson's general store on a Tuesday afternoon in late May while Eleanor was selecting thread, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floorboards, his hat dusty from a morning spent working cattle on the Rockingham Ranch, 10 miles north of town. She had been debating between 2 shades of blue thread, holding them up to the window light, when his voice had rumbled behind her, deep and warm like summer thunder rolling across the prairie. "The lighter one," he had said, "matches the sky better." She had turned, thread still clutched in both hands, and found herself looking into eyes the exact color of the thread she held in her left hand. That perfect Wyoming sky blue that seemed impossible until you saw it yourself. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of men who worked with their bodies, with sun-darkened skin and hair the color of wheat just before harvest. He had smiled at her, a slow, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes and tipped his hat. "James Cooper, miss." "Don't believe I've seen you around before, Eleanor Hartford." Her voice had come out steadier than she felt. "I'm the seamstress. I arrived this spring." "Well, Miss Hartford, welcome to Banner Creek." He had purchased a length of rope, a box of ammunition, and a peppermint stick that he had offered to her with an almost boyish shyness before leaving. And Eleanor had stood in the general store for a full minute after he left, still holding both spools of thread, her heart doing strange acrobatics in her chest. She had learned more about him over the following weeks through the careful gossip network that existed among the women of Banner Creek. James Cooper was 25 years old, had come to Wyoming Territory 3 years earlier from Texas after his father died, leaving him with nothing but a good horse and a strong work ethic. He had worked his way up from drifting ranch hand to foreman of the Rockingham, earning the respect of owner Marcus Montgomery through sheer competence and an almost supernatural ability with cattle and horses. He was honest, hardworking, never drank to excess, and had a reputation for fairness in his dealings. He was also, according to the sighing daughters of several prominent families, frustratingly uninterested in courtship. Too focused on saving money to start his own ranch, Mrs. Callahan had said, shaking her head while she kneaded bread dough. "That boy works himself near to death. Marcus Montgomery says he's never had a better foreman, says James could run his own spread easy if he just had the capital." Eleanor had filed away these pieces of information like precious stones, even as she told herself she was being foolish. She was new to town, had no family connections, no property, nothing but her skill with a needle and her determination to build an independent life. A man like James Cooper, even if he was just a foreman now, had prospects. He would want a wife who could bring something to a marriage beyond a trunk of sewing supplies and a stubborn streak. But then he had started finding excuses to visit town more frequently. He would tip his hat to her on the street, stop to chat about the weather or ask her opinion on fabric for new shirts he needed made. He had commissioned her to repair a torn saddle blanket, then to sew curtains for the foreman's cabin at the Rocking M, then to make him 3 new work shirts because his old ones were worn beyond repair. Each time he came to pick up the finished items, he would linger, talking easily about his day, about the cattle, about his dreams of eventually owning his own land. And Eleanor, despite all her resolutions about independence and self-sufficiency, had fallen hopelessly in love. It had crept up on her like dawn breaking over the prairie, so gradual she did not notice until she was completely immersed in it. She loved the way he spoke gently to his horse, the way he always held doors open for her, the way his face lit up when he saw her. She loved his work-roughened hands and his careful respect, the way he asked her opinion and actually listened to her answers. She loved his dreams and his determination, his kindness and his quiet strength. The problem was that she had no idea if he felt the same way. Oh, he was always friendly, always respectful, always seemed happy to see her. But he never pushed beyond the boundaries of propriety, never hinted at anything more than casual friendship. Eleanor had enough pride that she would not throw herself at a man who might simply see her as a convenient seamstress and pleasant conversation. So she had kept her feelings locked away, only allowing them out in the privacy of her small room, late at night when she worked on her secret project. The quilt commission from Mrs. Moss had given her the perfect excuse. Among all the founding family names and prominent citizens, she had added one square that was purely for herself, hidden among the others where no one would particularly notice. In careful cross-stitch, using thread the color of summer sky and wheat fields, she had begun stitching his name, James Cooper. It was foolish and sentimental, and she told herself it meant nothing, that it was simply part of the commission, that his name could reasonably be included as the foreman of one of the area's largest ranches. But she worked on his square alone, late at night, putting more care into those letters than any others on the quilt. She had surrounded his name with small, delicate designs, a horse, a lariat, a prairie rose, tiny stars. She had poured all her hidden feelings into those stitches, creating something beautiful that no one else would understand the significance of until tonight. Eleanor had been so focused on her work, on getting the curve of the final letter exactly right, that she had not heard the footsteps on the stairs. She had not heard her door, which she had foolishly left slightly ajar to catch the cross breeze in the summer heat, creak open wider. She had not noticed anything at all until James Cooper's voice, startled and confused, had broken the silence. "Is that my name?" The needle had jabbed into her finger as she jumped, and now she sat frozen, thumb pressed against the bleeding digit, staring up at James, who stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands, looking as shocked as she felt. "What are you doing here?" The words came out more sharply than she intended, panic making her voice harsh. "It's past 11 o'clock. I know, I'm sorry, I should have," he trailed off, his gaze fixed on the quilt spread across her lap. "Mrs. Callahan said I could come up. I rode in from the ranch because—" "Well, that doesn't matter now. Is that my name?" On that quilt, Eleanor's mind raced frantically. She could lie, could make up some excuse about the commission, about how his name was included as part of the town history. But the lie stuck in her throat, especially when she saw the expression on his face. He did not look offended or amused. He looked stunned, almost hopeful, as if he had stumbled onto something he had been searching for without knowing it. She swallowed hard, then lifted her chin with the same determination that had brought her west in the first place. "Yes, it's your name." He took a step into the room, then seemed to remember propriety and stopped, though his eyes never left the quilt. "Why?" "It's a commission," she said, the words tumbling out quickly. For the town anniversary celebration, Mrs. Moss wanted names of significant people in Banner Creek's history. I've only been here 3 years. His voice was quiet, measured, and his eyes finally lifted to meet hers. I'm not part of this town's history, not the kind that goes on commemorative quilts. He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something vulnerable and intense. So why is my name there, Eleanor? The sound of her given name in his voice, without the formal Miss Hartford, sent warmth flooding through her chest. She could not look away from him, could not think of another lie that would be convincing. The truth sat between them, as visible as the stitching on the fabric, and she was suddenly exhausted from hiding it. Because I wanted it there, she whispered. Because I've stitched every letter late at night when no one could see, because I've been foolish enough to care about whether your name sits beside mine on a piece of fabric that will hang in a town hall where no one will notice or understand what it means to me. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. James stood completely still in her doorway, his hat clutched in both hands now, his knuckles white against the dark felt. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the blood still seeping from her pricked finger, could smell the summer night air drifting through her window mixed with the scent of leather and horse and the soap James used. Eleanor. He said her name like a prayer, like a promise, and took 3 long steps into the room, propriety abandoned. He knelt beside her chair, setting his hat on the floor, and reached for the hand she still had pressed against her injured finger. Let me see. She let him take her hand, watched as he gently pulled her thumb away to examine the small wound. It was nothing, barely a pinprick, but he treated it with the careful attention he would give to something precious. He pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped it around her finger with surprising gentleness for such large, work-roughened hands. I rode into town tonight, he said quietly, his attention still focused on her hand, because I couldn't wait until tomorrow. Because I've been trying for weeks to work up the courage to ask you something, and every day I tell myself tomorrow I'll do it, and then I lose my nerve. He lifted his eyes to hers, and Eleanor saw her own feelings reflected back at her in that sky-blue gaze. I came to ask if you would allow me to court you properly, with intentions. Marriage intentions, if you'd have me, though I know I've got nothing much to offer yet except a foreman's salary and a lot of dreams about owning my own ranch someday. Eleanor's breath caught in her chest. You came here at 11 o'clock at night to ask to court me, a flush crept up his neck. I know it's not proper, I know I should have waited until morning and asked formally, and I wasn't thinking straight. I just couldn't stand another day not knowing if maybe you might feel even a fraction of what I feel for you. He glanced down at the quilt still spread across her lap, at his name stitched in careful, loving detail. Though I guess now I know. What do you feel for me? Eleanor needed to hear it, needed the words spoken aloud in the lamplight of her small room. James's grip on her hand tightened slightly. I'm in love with you. I've been in love with you since you stood in Patterson's store arguing with yourself about thread colors, looking so serious about it like it was the most important decision in the world. I'm in love with the way you laugh, the way you're not afraid to speak your mind, the way you see the world. I'm in love with your talent and your courage, and the fact that you came all the way out here alone to build a life for yourself. I love you, Eleanor Hartford, and I've been half crazy trying to figure out if I had any chance at all with you. The words hung in the air between them, more beautiful than any poetry Eleanor had ever read. She set the quilt carefully aside, not wanting to crease the fabric, and then she reached out with her free hand to touch James's face, feeling the slight stubble on his jaw, the warmth of his skin. I love you too, she said simply. I've been stitching your name into this quilt like some kind of lovesick girl because I didn't know how else to have a piece of you. I've been terrified that you only saw me as someone to mend your shirts. James laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy, and turned his face to press a kiss against her palm. I've ordered enough shirts from you to clothe half the territory. I kept hoping you'd realize I was just making up excuses to see you. I thought you were just particularly hard on your clothing." He smiled at that, then grew serious again. "So is that a yes? Will you let me court you proper? Let me take you to the church social next week and the town dance in August. Let me see where this goes, even though I can't offer you much right now." "Yes." Eleanor said it firmly, without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." James stood up then, drawing her up with him, and for a moment they simply stood facing each other in the lamplight, hands clasped between them. Then he reached up with one hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I'm going to kiss you now," he said quietly, "if that's all right with you." More than all right. His kiss was gentle, reverent, and tasted like peppermint and promises. Eleanor's free hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart hammering as hard as her own. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, James rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to leave. "It's not proper for me to be in your room like this." "Probably not," Eleanor agreed, also not moving. "Mrs. Callahan is going to have my hide." "Probably." They stood like that for another long moment before James finally, reluctantly, stepped back. He retrieved his hat from the floor, then paused to look at the quilt one more time. "Will you finish it?" he asked. "The square with my name." Eleanor looked down at the fabric, at the nearly complete stitching that spelled out his name surrounded by small symbols of everything she associated with him. "I had planned to. It's part of the commission." "No, I mean," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I mean, will you finish it the way you intended? With all those little details, all those stitches you were putting in just for yourself? Because I want everyone in this town to see my name on that quilt and know that you're the one who put it there with care, with," he met her eyes, "with love." Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. "You want everyone to know?" "I want everyone to know that I'm courting the most talented, beautiful, courageous woman in Wyoming Territory," James said firmly. "I want them to see that quilt and understand that you chose my name to stitch with extra care." "I'm proud of that, Eleanor, proud that you care enough about me to put that kind of work into something." "Then yes," Eleanor said softly, "I'll finish it, exactly the way I planned." James smiled, that slow, warm smile that had captured her heart months ago in the general store, and settled his hat on his head. "I'll be back tomorrow, proper calling hours. I'll talk to Mrs. Callahan about courting rules, do this the right way. I'll look forward to it." He paused at the door, looking back at her. "Eleanor?" "Yes, thank you for stitching my name, for caring enough to do that." After he left, Eleanor sank back into her chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. She looked down at the quilt, at James's name partially completed in careful cross-stitch, and picked up her needle again. Her finger had stopped bleeding, and her hand was steady as she began to work once more. But now, instead of hiding her feelings in secret late-night stitching, she was finishing something that would be displayed publicly, a declaration of her feelings that the whole town would see even if they did not fully understand it. She worked until nearly 2 in the morning, until the final stitch was complete, and James's name sat perfect and beautiful on the cream-colored fabric, surrounded by symbols of horses and ropes and prairie roses and stars. Tomorrow she would begin courting James Cooper properly, with the whole town watching and speculating. But tonight, she had this moment. This quiet accomplishment of finishing something she had started in secret hope and was completing in open joy. Eleanor carefully folded the quilt and set it in her trunk, then prepared for bed, exhaustion finally catching up with her. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought about James riding 10 miles in the dark just because he could not wait another day to ask to court her, and she smiled into her pillow. True to his word, James appeared at Mrs. Callahan's boarding house the next afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock, bathed and shaved and wearing one of the shirts Eleanor had made for him. Mrs. Callahan answered the door with raised eyebrows and a knowing look, but she allowed him into the parlor and called Eleanor down from her room. She then positioned herself in a chair by the window with her mending, close enough to serve as chaperone but far enough to allow conversation. "Miss Hartford," James said formally, standing when Eleanor entered. "Thank you for receiving me." Eleanor bit back a smile at his sudden formality after last night's declarations in her bedroom. "Mr. Cooper, what a pleasant surprise." Mrs. Callahan snorted quietly from her corner but said nothing. They sat on opposite ends of the settee, a carefully proper distance apart, and made polite conversation about the weather and the upcoming church social. After exactly 30 minutes, James stood to leave, thanking Mrs. Callahan for her hospitality and asking if he might call again the following day. Permission was granted and Eleanor walked him to the door. "This is much more awkward than last night," he murmured quietly as he settled his hat on his head. "Much more proper, though," Eleanor whispered back. "Will you walk with me to church on Sunday? I would like that." He smiled, tipped his hat and left, and Eleanor turned to find Mrs. Callahan watching her with shrewd eyes. "So the foreman from Rockingham has finally made his move," the older woman said. "About time. The whole town's been watching you two dance around each other for months." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I didn't realize we were so obvious." "Oh, honey, you weren't obvious at all. That's what made it so frustrating to watch. Two people clearly smitten, both too cautious to do anything about it." Mrs. Callahan set down her mending and fixed Eleanor with a serious look. "James Cooper is a good man. Works hard, honest, treats people right. He'll make someone a fine husband if he ever saves enough to start his own place. But he's got no family money, no property yet. You sure that's what you want?" "I came west with nothing but a small inheritance and a carpetbag full of sewing supplies," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm not looking for someone with money or property. I'm looking for someone who sees me as a partner, who respects what I can do, who I can build something with. James is that person." Mrs. Callahan smiled, warm and approving. "Good answer. Then you have my blessing for what it's worth. Just keep things proper until there's a ring and a preacher involved, understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Over the following weeks, Eleanor and James settled into a pattern of courtship that quickly became the talk of Banner Creek. He called on her 3 times a week at the boarding house, always prompt, always respectful, always meticulously proper under Mrs. Callahan's watchful eye. On Sundays, he escorted her to church, sitting beside her in the pew with their shoulders just barely touching, singing hymns in a surprisingly good baritone that made her heart flutter. They attended the church social together, where James proved to be an adequate dancer and an excellent conversationalist, and they walked together through town in the evenings when he could get away from the ranch early enough. But it was the small moments that Eleanor treasured most. The way James would bring her wildflowers picked on his ride into town, always looking slightly embarrassed as he presented them. The way he listened intently when she talked about her work, asking intelligent questions about stitching techniques and fabric choices. The way his face lit up whenever he saw her, as if she was the best part of his day. The way he spoke about his dreams for the future, now including her in those dreams as naturally as breathing. "I've been saving for 4 years now," he told her one evening as they walked along the creek that gave the town its name. "Marcus Montgomery says I've nearly got enough to make a down payment on the old Harrison place. It's 500 acres, good water, decent grass. The house needs work, but it's sound. If I can swing the purchase, I could start building my own herd, maybe keep working for Marcus part-time until I'm established." "That sounds wonderful," Eleanor said, trying to ignore the small voice in her head that whispered about timelines, about how long it might take before James felt established enough to marry. He must have heard something in her voice because he stopped walking and turned to face her. "Eleanor, I'm not talking about some distant someday future. I'm talking about this fall if the bank approves the loan. I'm talking about building something real, something permanent." He took both her hands in his. "I'm talking about asking you to marry me once I have something concrete to offer you beyond hopes and maybes." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. James, I know we've only been courting officially for a few weeks, he said quickly. And I know proper courtship is supposed to last months, maybe a year. But I'm 25 years old, Eleanor, and I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I don't need more time to know that you're who I want to build a life with. So I'm telling you now, straight out, that once I close on that property, I'm going to ask you properly. And I'm hoping the answer will be yes. You're asking me if I'll say yes to a proposal you haven't made yet for a marriage that won't happen until you buy property you don't own yet. Eleanor could not help the slight laugh that escaped. James grinned, looking sheepish. When you put it that way, it sounds pretty foolish. It sounds perfect, Eleanor corrected, squeezing his hands. And yes, when you ask me properly, after you've bought your property and have something concrete to offer, the answer will be yes. The kiss he gave her then was less gentle than their first, full of promise and barely restrained passion, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Eleanor glanced around quickly, relieved to see they were alone on this stretch of creek bank, hidden from the town by a bend and a stand of cottonwood trees. We should get back before people talk, she said reluctantly. Let them talk, James muttered, but he released her and offered his arm, and they walked back toward town in companionable silence, both lost in thoughts of the future. Eleanor threw herself into finishing the commemorative quilt with renewed energy. Word had spread about her courtship with James, and Mrs. Moss had stopped by to inspect the work, her sharp eyes lingering on the square that bore James Cooper's name with its intricate surrounding details. You've put quite a lot of work into this particular square, she observed, her tone neutral but her expression knowing. Mr. Cooper is the foreman of Rockingham, Eleanor said calmly. One of the most successful ranches in the area. I thought his contribution to the community deserved recognition. Mrs. Moss smiled slightly. Of course, very appropriate. She examined the rest of the quilt, nodding approval at the quality of the work. You have real talent, Miss Hartford. This will be a beautiful addition to the town hall. I expect it to be finished by the end of September for the anniversary celebration. It will be ready, Eleanor promised. After Mrs. Moss left, Eleanor spread the quilt across her bed, examining each square carefully. The names of founding families were stitched in neat, careful letters. Montgomery, Patterson, Callahan, Moss, Harrison, Walker. Each name was surrounded by simple, appropriate designs representing their contributions to the town. And there, among them, was James Cooper's name with its horses and ropes and prairie roses and stars, standing out not because it was more elaborate than the others, but because every stitch carried love. She worked on the border that evening, a pattern of interlocking rings that would frame the entire quilt, when Mrs. Callahan knocked on her door. Letter came for you, the older woman said, handing over an envelope. From Philadelphia. Eleanor's stomach tightened as she recognized her aunt's handwriting. She had written to her aunt months ago, informing her of her safe arrival in Wyoming Territory, but this was the first response she had received. She waited until Mrs. Callahan left before opening it, steeling herself for reproach. The letter was exactly what she expected. Her aunt wrote in clipped, disapproving sentences about Eleanor's foolishness in running west, about the unsuitability of frontier life for a gently bred young woman, about how the banker had been deeply offended by her rejection and subsequent disappearance. But it was the final paragraph that made Eleanor's hands shake. I have learned from mutual acquaintances that you are currently courting some cowboy who has no property and no prospects. I forbid this match absolutely. You will return to Philadelphia immediately, where I have secured you a position as companion to Mrs. Worthington, widow of the late judge. This is a respectable position that will allow you to redeem yourself in society's eyes. Your train fare is enclosed. I expect you within the month. Eleanor stared at the letter for a long moment, then deliberately tore it in half, then in quarters, then into pieces so small the words were unreadable. She threw the pieces in her wastebasket along with the bank draft her aunt had included for train fare, and returned to her quilting with hands that gradually stopped shaking. She had not come west to be rescued or redirected by her aunt's notion of respectability. She had come to build her own life, make her own choices, and she had found something here worth staying for. Her aunt had no power over her anymore, no ability to dictate her future. That power belonged to Eleanor alone, and she chose James, chose Banner Creek, chose the life she was building stitch by careful stitch. The summer heat intensified as July gave way to August, turning the prairie grass golden and making even the simplest tasks exhausting. James's visits became shorter but more frequent as ranch work intensified. He would ride in after dinner, dusty and tired, just to spend an hour sitting with Eleanor in Mrs. Callahan's parlor before riding back to the ranch in the dark. Eleanor treasured those visits even more than the longer ones, knowing what it cost him in exhaustion to make the trip. "You don't have to come so often," she told him one evening, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "I understand that the ranch keeps you busy." "I come because it's the best part of my day," he said simply. "Because seeing you, even for an hour, makes all the rest of it worthwhile." The town dance in mid-August proved to be a revelation. Eleanor had made herself a new dress for the occasion, a soft blue cotton that matched James's eyes, with careful pin-tucking on the bodice and mother-of-pearl buttons down the back. When James called for her that evening, the expression on his face made all the hours of sewing worthwhile. "You look beautiful," he said, and his voice carried such sincerity that Eleanor felt warmth flood through her. The dance was held in the largest barn on the Montgomery property, cleaned and decorated with lanterns and bunting for the occasion. Nearly everyone in Banner Creek attended, from old Mr. Patterson, who owned the general store, to the youngest children who raced around the edges of the dance floor, shrieking with laughter. Marcus Montgomery himself, a prosperous man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and shrewd eyes, made a point of greeting Eleanor warmly. "So you're the young lady who's captured my foreman's attention," he said, shaking her hand. "James hasn't stopped talking about you for months. I was beginning to think he'd made you up." "I assure you I'm quite real, Mr. Montgomery," Eleanor replied, smiling. "And quite talented from what I hear. My wife says you're making the commemorative quilt for the town's celebration." "I am. It's been a challenging project but a rewarding one." Montgomery nodded approvingly. "James tells me you came out here alone from Philadelphia. That takes courage." "I like courage." He glanced at James, who stood quietly beside Eleanor. "I also like people who aren't afraid to work hard for what they want. You've chosen well, James." "I know, sir," James said quietly, his hand coming to rest lightly on Eleanor's back. The dancing started shortly after, and James led Eleanor onto the floor for a waltz. He was a better dancer than he had claimed, moving with the same easy grace he showed working with horses, and Eleanor relaxed into his lead, letting the music carry them. "Montgomery pulled me aside yesterday," James said quietly as they turned. "Asked me about my plans for the Harrison property. I told him I was hoping to close the purchase by the end of September." Eleanor's breath caught. And he said he'd write a letter to the bank recommending me as a good risk. Also said he'd be willing to sell me 10 head of breeding cattle at cost once I close, let me pay him back over time. James's voice was tight with suppressed excitement. "Eleanor, this is really happening. I'm going to own my own place. We're going to have a future." "We already have a future," Eleanor said softly, "but I'm glad it's coming together so quickly." They danced until Eleanor's feet ached in her good shoes, then slipped outside for air, finding a quiet spot near the corral where they could see stars brilliant against the black Wyoming sky. James pulled her close, and they stood together in comfortable silence, listening to the music drifting from the barn and the soft sounds of horses moving in the corral. "My parents would have liked you," James said suddenly. "My mother especially. She was strong like you, not afraid of hard work. She ran our farm in Texas pretty much single-handed while my father—" He trailed off, and Eleanor heard old pain in his voice. "Well, while my father drank away most of what she earned. When she died, something in him broke completely. He was gone within 6 months. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, turning in his arms to face him. "It taught me some things," James continued. "Taught me that I never wanted to be like him, never wanted to make a woman work herself to death while I wasted what she built. Taught me that when I found someone worth building a life with, I wanted to be a true partner, share the work and the rewards equally." His hands came up to frame her face. "You're that person, Eleanor, and I promise you when we marry, when we build that ranch together, I'll work as hard as you do. I'll value what you bring to our life as much as what I bring. We'll be partners in every way." Eleanor's eyes stung with sudden tears. "That's all I've ever wanted, to be seen as a partner, not as property or decoration." "I see you," James said fiercely. "I see your strength and your talent and your courage. I see the life you built here alone, the respect you've earned with your skill. And I want to build something with you, not for you. With you, Eleanor." She kissed him then, not caring if anyone saw them, pouring all her love and hope and trust into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "September," he whispered. "By September, I'll have the property and I'll ask you properly and we'll start building our future together." "September," Eleanor agreed. The final weeks of August passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor finished the commemorative quilt, delivering it to Mrs. Moss with pride. The older woman examined every stitch carefully, then nodded her approval. "Beautiful work, Miss Hartford. The town will be proud to display this." She folded the quilt carefully and paid Eleanor the agreed-upon sum, plus a bonus that made Eleanor's eyes widen. "You've earned it. This is museum-quality work." With the extra money, Eleanor began quietly assembling a trousseau. She bought fabric and sewed herself 2 new dresses, practical calico for everyday wear. She purchased sturdy shoes and warm stockings for winter, needles and thread and scissors. All the small necessities she would need when she left Mrs. Callahan's boarding house for a ranch house that needed work. She packed everything carefully in her trunk, keeping her preparations private, not wanting to jinx the future by speaking of it too openly. James, meanwhile, was deep in negotiations with the bank and the Harrison family. The property had sat empty for 2 years, since old John Harrison died and his children moved back east, but the bank had been reluctant to sell to someone without established credit or family connections. Marcus Montgomery's recommendation changed everything. By the 3rd week of September, James had secured a loan with reasonable terms and a closing date set for the last day of the month. "It's really happening," he told Eleanor, his voice filled with wonder. They were sitting in Mrs. Callahan's parlor, properly chaperoned as always, but James was holding Eleanor's hand openly now, not caring who saw. "I'll sign the papers on September 30th. The property will be mine. The house needs work, but Marcus is giving me 3 weeks off in October to get it livable before winter. He's already hired a temporary replacement foreman." 3 weeks isn't much time," Eleanor said practically. "What needs to be done? The roof needs patching, several windows need replacing, the stove is cracked and needs fixing or replacing, and the whole place needs a thorough cleaning. The barn is in better shape, thank God, and the well is good." He looked at her seriously. "It's going to be rough at first, Eleanor. It's not going to be comfortable or easy. Are you sure you're ready for that?" "I'm sure," Eleanor said firmly. "I didn't come west looking for easy or comfortable. I came looking for real, and that's what you're offering me." James smiled, then pulled a small box from his pocket. "I know I said I'd wait until after the closing to ask you properly, but I can't wait anymore, and I want to do this right the way you deserve." He slid off the settee onto one knee, and Eleanor heard Mrs. Callahan make a soft sound from her corner, though whether of approval or surprise she could not tell. "Eleanor Hartford," James said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "You're the bravest, most talented, most beautiful woman I've ever known. You've made me believe in futures I thought were impossible, made me want to be a better man, made me understand what it means to be truly partnered with someone. I love you more than I have words for, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to show you how much. Will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a ranch that needs work and a cowboy who has more dreams than money, but who promises to work every day to make those dreams real for both of us? Yes, Eleanor said, her voice thick with tears. Yes, absolutely yes. The ring James slipped onto her finger was simple but beautiful. A small diamond set in silver that caught the lamplight and sparkled like the stars they had watched together the night of the dance. Eleanor stared at it, this tangible symbol of their future, and felt joy so intense it was almost painful. Mrs. Callahan appeared with a bottle of elderberry wine she had been saving for a special occasion, and they toasted the engagement properly. Word spread through town overnight, as word always did in Banner Creek, and by the next morning, Eleanor could not walk down the street without being stopped for congratulations. The commemorative quilt was displayed in the new town hall on the day of the 10th anniversary celebration, hung prominently on the main wall where everyone entering could see it. Eleanor stood beside James as the town gathered to admire it, and she felt pride as people pointed out different squares, different names, different details she had worked into the fabric. "There's your name," Eleanor said quietly to James, pointing to his square. He studied it carefully, taking in the horses and ropes, the prairie roses and stars, the careful stitching that spelled out his name. "You put your heart into this," he said softly. "I can see it in every stitch." "I did," Eleanor admitted. "Before I even knew if you felt the same way, I was putting my love into these stitches." "I'm glad you didn't give up on me," James said, pulling her close despite the crowd around them. "I'm glad you kept stitching my name, kept hoping, because look where it led us." Eleanor looked around at the town that had become her home, at the people who had accepted her, at the man standing beside her with his arm around her waist, and his future spreading out before them like the Wyoming prairie, full of possibility. She looked at the quilt, at all those names stitched together into something beautiful and lasting, and she smiled. Look where it led us indeed. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church at the heart of Banner Creek, with half the town in attendance and Mrs. Callahan crying openly in the front pew. Eleanor wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored linen with lace at the collar and cuffs, simple but elegant. James wore a new suit that had required a special order from the general store, and he looked so handsome that Eleanor's breath caught when she saw him waiting for her at the altar. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, the minister speaking about partnership and commitment and building lives together. When James slipped a simple gold band beside her engagement ring and promised to love and cherish her, Eleanor felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was what she had come west for, this feeling of building something real with someone who saw her as an equal. The reception was held at Mrs. Callahan's boarding house, the dining room and parlor packed with well-wishers. Marcus Montgomery gave them a generous check as a wedding gift and reiterated his offer of breeding cattle at cost. Mrs. Moss presented Eleanor with a beautiful set of embroidered pillowcases she had made herself. Even Patterson from the general store contributed a box of supplies for their new home, everything from flour and sugar to lamp oil and candles. As the sun began to set, James and Eleanor said their goodbyes and rode out to their new property in the wagon James had borrowed from the ranch, all their combined possessions packed in the back. Eleanor's trunk, James's bedroll and few personal items, the gifts from their wedding and a lot of hope. The Harrison place looked even rougher in the fading light than James had described. The house was a simple two-room cabin built of logs, with a covered porch that sagged on one end and windows that definitely needed replacing. But smoke rose from the chimney and lamplight glowed through the wavy glass, and when James helped Eleanor down from the wagon, she could see he had made an effort to prepare the place for her arrival. "I know it's not much," he started, but Eleanor put her fingers over his lips. "It's ours," she said simply. "That makes it perfect. Inside, she found that James had spent his 3 weeks of leave wisely. The place was clean, the floors scrubbed, the windows washed as well as possible given their condition. The roof had been patched, new chinning installed between the logs, and the stove repaired. The main room served as kitchen and living area with a table and 2 chairs, a dry sink, the stove, and some rough shelving. The second room was the bedroom, containing a double bed frame that James admitted to building himself, a mattress stuffed with fresh prairie grass, and quilts borrowed from Mrs. Callahan until Eleanor could make their own. "The barn is solid," James said, giving her the tour. "I've got space for a dozen head of cattle plus horses. The well is good, never runs dry even in summer. And see that meadow beyond the barn? That's where I want to start building the herd. Good grass, good water, sheltered from the worst of the winter wind." Eleanor looked out at land that was now half hers, at the meadow turning gold in the sunset, at the mountains visible in the distance. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, and it was theirs to build something on. "Show me the rest," she said, taking his hand. They walked the property as the sun set, James pointing out boundaries and water sources, good grass and sheltered areas. He talked about his plans for the future, where he wanted to expand, what kind of cattle he wanted to raise, how many years before they could be truly profitable. And Eleanor listened, adding her own thoughts, her own observations, already starting to see this land as theirs rather than his. When full dark had fallen and they returned to the house, James lit the lamps and turned to Eleanor with sudden shyness. "I realize we're married now," he said, "and I know what that means, but I want you to know there's no pressure, no expectation. We can take this as slow as you need." Eleanor smiled at his careful courtesy, loving him even more for it. She stepped close, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "James Cooper, I chose you. I came west looking for partnership and possibility, and I found both in you. I'm not afraid of any part of being your wife." The kiss he gave her then was different from all their previous kisses, deeper and more passionate, full of promise and desire, no longer restrained by propriety. Eleanor responded with equal passion, her arms coming around his neck, her body pressing close to his. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, James swept her up in his arms and carried her to the bedroom, and Eleanor laughed with pure joy. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, and occasionally awkward in the way of 2 people learning each other for the first time, but it was also perfect in its imperfection. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed James had built, under borrowed quilts, listening to the wind move through the prairie grass outside their window. "Happy?" James asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Completely," Eleanor said, and meant it with her whole heart. The first months of their marriage were harder than Eleanor had anticipated, but also more rewarding. James divided his time between working on the ranch infrastructure and taking short-term jobs with neighboring spreads to bring in ready cash. Eleanor sewed for anyone who needed it, her reputation ensuring a steady stream of commissions. Together, they slowly transformed the rough cabin into a real home. Eleanor made curtains for the windows, braided rugs for the floors, and began work on a real quilt for their bed, this one featuring a pattern of interlocking rings she called double wedding ring. James built her a proper workbench for her sewing, installed better shelving in the kitchen, and constructed a chicken coop behind the house. In early November, he brought home 6 hens and a rooster, and Eleanor learned to gather eggs and deal with chickens. Marcus Montgomery delivered the 10 head of breeding cattle he had promised in mid-November, along with a young bull he threw in as an additional wedding gift. James spent a week building fences and preparing the winter feeding area, and Eleanor found herself learning more about cattle management than she ever expected. She learned to recognize different breeds, to understand breeding cycles and feeding requirements, to spot signs of illness or injury. "You're a natural," James told her one evening as they stood watching their small herd settle for the night. "Most ranch wives don't take this much interest in the actual cattle operation." I'm not most ranch wives, Eleanor replied, and you promised me partnership, remember? I'm not going to sit in the house sewing while you do all the outdoor work alone. James grinned and pulled her close. I remember, and I'm grateful for it every day. The first winter was brutal. Snow came in late November and stayed through March, piling in drifts that sometimes buried the bottom rails of the fences. Temperatures dropped so low that water froze in the bucket between the well and the house, and Eleanor learned to dress in layers even indoors. They burned through wood faster than James had anticipated, and he spent hours each week cutting and hauling more, often in conditions that made Eleanor terrified he would get lost or injured. But they survived. They huddled together for warmth at night, played cards by lamplight when the wind howled too loud for conversation, read aloud from the few books they owned. James taught Eleanor to play chess using pieces he carved from scrap wood, and Eleanor taught James to do basic mending, insisting he should know how to repair his own clothes in case of emergency. They learned each other's habits and rhythms, learned to work together efficiently, learned that they could depend on each other absolutely. By the time spring arrived in late March of 1877, Eleanor realized she had not had her monthly courses in 6 weeks. She said nothing to James at first, waiting until she was certain, but by mid-April there was no doubt. She was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday afternoon as they sat on the porch together, watching the prairie turn green and the cattle graze peacefully in the meadow. She simply took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach and said, "We're going to have a baby in November." James's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, confusion, wonder, and finally pure joy. He pulled her into his arms carefully as if she might break and held her while he processed the news. "A baby," he repeated. "Eleanor, we're going to have a baby." "We are," she confirmed, smiling at his stunned expression. "Are you all right? Is everything? Do you need to see the doctor? Should you be working so hard? Maybe you should rest more, or—" Eleanor laughed and kissed him to stop the flood of questions. "I'm fine, healthy. The doctor says everything is progressing normally. I'll need to take things a bit easier as I get farther along, but right now I'm perfectly capable of continuing my normal activities." James looked like he wanted to argue but forced himself to nod. "All right, but you tell me if you need anything, if you're tired or not feeling well. Promise me." "I promise." Over the following months, Eleanor continued her sewing work while her belly grew round. She made tiny clothes for the baby, little gowns and caps and blankets, working on them in the evenings while James read aloud or worked on ranch accounts. James became almost comically protective, insisting on doing all the heavy work and fretting whenever Eleanor lifted anything heavier than a teacup. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Eleanor reminded him repeatedly, but she was touched by his concern. The baby arrived on a cold November night, nearly 3 weeks early, catching them both unprepared. Eleanor's water broke while she was washing dishes after dinner, and James went white as snow when he realized what was happening. He rode hell for leather into town to fetch the doctor while Mrs. Callahan, who had come out for a visit and happened to still be there, helped Eleanor into bed and began preparations. By the time James returned with Dr. Matthews, Eleanor was deep in labor, gripping Mrs. Callahan's hand and breathing through contractions that seemed to tear her apart. James stood helplessly by the door until Dr. Matthews ordered him to boil water and find clean towels, giving him tasks to keep him busy. The labor lasted through the night and into the early morning hours. Eleanor had known it would be painful, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it, the overwhelming intensity that blocked out everything else. She heard James's voice at one point, arguing with Dr. Matthews about whether he could come in, and she heard Mrs. Callahan firmly telling him to stay in the other room and let the women work. Finally, as dawn was breaking, the baby was born. A boy, small but healthy, with a surprisingly loud cry for his size and a shock of dark hair. Dr. Matthews cleaned him quickly and placed him in Eleanor's arms, and she stared down at the tiny face, overwhelmed by sudden, fierce love for this small person she and James had created. "James," she called, her voice hoarse from hours of labor, "come meet your son." James entered the room cautiously, as if afraid everything might shatter, and stopped dead when he saw Eleanor holding the baby. His face crumpled with emotion, and he crossed the room in 3 long strides, kneeling beside the bed to stare at his son. "He's perfect," James whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. The infant immediately gripped his father's finger and James made a choked sound. "Eleanor, he's perfect. What should we name him?" Eleanor asked. They had discussed names but never quite settled on one. James was quiet for a long moment, staring at his son. "Joseph," he said finally. "After my father but without his mistakes. Joseph James Cooper, and we'll call him Joe." "Hello, Joe," Eleanor whispered to the baby, who had stopped crying and was looking around with unfocused eyes. "Welcome to Wyoming Territory." Recovery from childbirth was harder than Eleanor had anticipated. Her body ached in ways she had not expected, and she was exhausted beyond anything she had experienced. But James was wonderful, taking over all the household tasks without complaint, bringing her meals in bed, changing baby Joe's diapers with clumsy determination. Mrs. Callahan stayed for a week, teaching both of them the basics of infant care before reluctantly returning to town. "You're both going to be fine," she assured them as James drove her back to Banner Creek. "That baby is healthy and strong, and you two are good parents already. Trust yourselves." The winter of 1877 into 1878 was challenging in new ways. Joe was a fussy baby, waking every few hours to eat, and Eleanor spent those months in a fog of exhaustion. But there were perfect moments too. Watching James hold his son with infinite gentleness, seeing Joe's first real smile, hearing his first laugh. The cattle business continued to grow, and by spring they were able to purchase 5 more head of breeding stock, expanding their herd significantly. As Joe grew from infant to toddler, Eleanor gradually resumed her sewing business and her work around the ranch. She learned to manage household tasks with a small child underfoot, learned to nurse Joe while simultaneously working on simpler sewing projects, learned the delicate balance of being mother, wife, seamstress, and rancher all at once. "You're amazing," James told her one evening, watching her put together dinner with one hand while holding Joe on her hip with the other. "I don't know how you do it all." "Same way you do," Eleanor replied pragmatically. "One task at a time and asking for help when I need it." The ranch continued to prosper. By the summer of 1879, they owned nearly 30 head of cattle, had expanded the barn, and had begun building a larger house to replace the original cabin. James had proven to have excellent instincts for cattle ranching, and several neighboring spreads had hired him as a consultant for their operations, bringing in additional income. Eleanor's reputation as a seamstress had spread beyond Banner Creek, and she occasionally received commissions from as far away as Cheyenne. Joe turned 3 in November of 1879, a bright, energetic boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determination. He followed James everywhere, mimicking his father's walk and speech, insisting on helping with ranch chores even though he was usually more hindrance than help. Eleanor watched them together and felt her heart swell with love and contentment. In early 1880, Eleanor realized she was pregnant again. This time the news was less of a shock but no less joyful. James immediately went into protective mode again, insisting Eleanor reduce her workload, and Joe was informed he was going to be a big brother, though he did not seem to fully understand what that meant. The second baby, a girl, was born in September of 1880 with far less drama than Joe's birth. The labor was shorter, Eleanor knew what to expect, and by the time Dr. Matthews arrived, the baby was already crowning. Clara Rose Cooper came into the world just after midnight, smaller than Joe had been but just as healthy, with Eleanor's dark hair, and they would later discover James's easy temperament. Joe was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to hold her constantly, bringing her his favorite toys, singing to her in his childish voice. James walked around in a daze for days, unable to believe they now had 2 children, 2 perfect little people who were half him and half Eleanor. "We did this," he said one night, standing over Clara's cradle while she slept. "We built this life, this family, this ranch, all of it together." Eleanor came to stand beside him, Joe already asleep in his bed across the room. She leaned against James, tired but happy, and looked at their daughter, their son, the home they had created. "We did," she agreed, "and we'll keep building it together." The years that followed were full and busy. The ranch continued to grow, eventually expanding to over 1,000 acres and nearly 200 head of cattle. James hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, young men who lived in the converted barn and took their meals at the main house. The new house was finished in 1881, a proper 2-story structure with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a parlor, and even a room designated as Eleanor's sewing room. Joe grew into a serious, responsible boy who loved the ranch and everything about it. Clara was more adventurous, constantly getting into mischief, keeping her parents on their toes. In 1883, Eleanor gave birth to another son, Thomas, called Tommy, who proved to be the perfect balance between his older siblings' temperaments. Through it all, Eleanor and James's love deepened and matured. The passionate romance of their courtship evolved into something richer, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared labor, and absolute trust. They disagreed sometimes, argued occasionally, but they always worked through problems together, never letting anger fester. Eleanor continued her sewing work, though she was more selective about commissions now, taking only projects that truly interested her. She made quilts for each of her children, elaborate affairs that told stories in fabric and thread. She taught Clara to sew when the girl was old enough, passing on skills and knowledge. James achieved his dream of a prosperous ranch, and then exceeded it, becoming known throughout the territory as an astute cattleman and fair employer. He served on the town council, helped establish a proper school in Banner Creek, and mentored young men who wanted to learn ranching. But his greatest pride was always his family, the life he had built with Eleanor. On a warm evening in the summer of 1885, nearly 10 years after their marriage, Eleanor and James sat on the porch of their home watching the sun set over land they owned, their cattle grazing peacefully, their children playing in the yard. Joe was 8 now, Clara nearly 5, Tommy 2. The ranch was thriving, their family was healthy, and the future stretched out before them full of possibility. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked quietly. "Leaving Philadelphia, coming out here to this hard life?" Eleanor reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "Never, not once. This is exactly the life I wanted, the life I chose. I chose you, James Cooper, and I'd make that choice again every single day." James lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I love you, Eleanor, more now than even when I found you stitching my name into that quilt in secret." Eleanor smiled, remembering that night so long ago when James had appeared in her doorway and discovered her secret. That quilt still hung in the Banner Creek Town Hall, a piece of local history now, but they had created so much more than a quilt. They had created a life, a family, a legacy that would last generations. "I love you too," she said simply, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, knowing that whatever challenges the future brought, they would face them together as they always had, partners in every sense of the word. The children grew up surrounded by love and hard work. Joe took to ranching like he was born to it, learning everything James could teach him and showing an instinct for cattle that promised he would run the ranch someday. Clara proved to have her mother's talent with a needle but also developed a passion for horses, spending hours in the barn learning to train and handle them. Tommy, the youngest, was quieter than his siblings but sharp as a tack, always reading when he could get his hands on a book. In 1887, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise given that Tommy was already 5 and they had thought their family complete. James was delighted but worried, knowing that Eleanor was now 33 and childbirth carried more risks as women aged. But Eleanor refused to coddle herself, continuing her normal activities right up until her water broke in early February of 1888. This birth was the hardest yet, long and complicated, and for several hours Dr. Matthews was concerned they might lose either mother or baby. But Eleanor was strong, stubborn, and determined to survive, and in the end she delivered a healthy baby girl they named Rose, after the prairie roses that had adorned James's square on that long-ago quilt. "No more," James said firmly as he held his exhausted wife afterward, baby Rose sleeping peacefully in the cradle beside the bed. "I won't risk you like this again, Eleanor. 4 children is plenty." Eleanor, too tired to argue and secretly agreeing with him, simply nodded. 4 children was indeed plenty, more than she had ever imagined having. Their family was complete. The late 1880s brought challenges beyond childbirth. A severe drought in 1888 decimated the range, forcing James to sell off a third of their herd at rock-bottom prices, just to ensure the remaining cattle had enough food and water to survive. The winter of 1888 into 1889 was one of the worst in Wyoming Territory history, with temperatures dropping so low that cattle froze standing up. James and his ranch hands worked around the clock to save what animals they could, and Eleanor kept the house running, feeding everyone, tending the children, managing everything so James could focus on the crisis. They lost another quarter of their herd that winter, devastating losses that would take years to recover from. But they survived, and the cattle that made it through proved to be hardy stock worth breeding from. By 1890, as Wyoming prepared for statehood, the Cooper Ranch was rebuilding, slower than before but on a more solid foundation. Joe was 13 now, tall and capable, working the ranch alongside his father and the hired hands. Clara, 8 years old, had become an accomplished rider and was starting to show interest in training horses professionally. Tommy, 7, had developed a fascination with numbers and ledgers, often helping Eleanor with the ranch accounts. And Rose, just 2, was a bright, happy child who charmed everyone she met. When Wyoming achieved statehood in July of 1890, the Cooper family traveled to Cheyenne for the celebration. It was the first time any of the children had been to a real city, and their excitement was contagious. James held Eleanor's hand as they watched the ceremonies, both of them thinking about how far they had come from that night in 1876, when he had found her stitching his name into a quilt in secret. "We helped build this," James said quietly, gesturing at the celebration around them. "Not just the 2 of us, but everyone like us. People who came here with nothing but dreams and determination, who built ranches and towns and lives out of raw territory. We're part of Wyoming's history now, Eleanor." Eleanor thought about the commemorative quilt she had made so long ago, wondered if it still hung in Banner Creek's town hall or if it had been stored away and forgotten. But it did not matter. The real legacy she and James were leaving was not stitched in fabric, but built in land and cattle and, most importantly, in their children who would carry on what they had started. The 1890s brought prosperity and growth. The ranch expanded again as James carefully rebuilt their herd with high-quality breeding stock. They purchased additional land, eventually owning over 1,500 acres of prime grazing territory. James hired more hands, built better facilities, and earned a reputation as one of the most successful ranchers in the state. Eleanor's sewing business evolved. She no longer took general commissions, but instead focused on specialized work, creating elaborate quilts and embroidered pieces for wealthy clients in Cheyenne and even Denver. Her work commanded high prices, and she was able to contribute significantly to the family finances, maintaining the independence and partnership she and James had always shared. The children grew into young adults. Joe became a full partner in the ranch operation when he turned 18 in 1895, bringing new ideas and energy to the business. Clara started a horse training operation on ranch property, earning money and respect breaking and training horses for clients throughout the state. Tommy went to college in Laramie, studying business and agriculture, planning to return to the ranch with knowledge that would help modernize their operations. Rose, still young, showed artistic talent that Eleanor nurtured, teaching her advanced sewing techniques and encouraging her creativity. In 1898, as the new century approached, Eleanor and James celebrated their 23rd wedding anniversary with a party attended by half the county. It was held in the large barn, decorated much like it had been for the dance where James had first held Eleanor properly in his arms so many years ago. Their children were there, friends they had made over decades, neighbors who had become family, ranch hands past and present. Marcus Montgomery, now in his 70s and semi-retired, raised a glass in toast. 23 years ago, I watched my best foreman fall head over heels for a seamstress from Philadelphia. I watched him work himself nearly to death to build something worthy of her. And I watched them build not just a ranch, but a real partnership, a real family, a real legacy. James and Eleanor Cooper represent everything that's best about Wyoming: hard work, determination, loyalty, and love, to 23 more years. Everyone cheered and drank, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. She looked at James, still handsome at 47 though his hair was now streaked with silver and lines creased his face. He caught her looking and smiled, that same slow, warm smile that had captured her heart in Patterson's general store so long ago. Later that night, after all the guests had left and the children had gone to bed, Eleanor and James walked out to the porch of their home, looking out over land they had built a life on. The moon was full, casting silver light over the prairie, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. "Do you remember the night you found me stitching your name?" Eleanor asked, leaning against James. "Like it was yesterday," James replied, his arm coming around her waist. "I thought I was going to die of shock and hope all at once, seeing my name on that fabric with all those careful stitches around it. I was terrified you'd think I was foolish. I thought you were perfect." James turned her to face him, both hands coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that had not diminished in 23 years of marriage. "I still think you're perfect, Eleanor Cooper. You're the best decision I ever made, the best partner I could have asked for, the best mother to our children. You're everything." Eleanor kissed him, pouring decades of love into that kiss, grateful beyond words that she had taken that train west, had answered that advertisement, had taken a chance on an unknown territory and an uncertain future. She had found everything she needed in a cowboy with sky-blue eyes and a genuine smile, in land that was harsh but beautiful, in a life built stitch by stitch, day by day, into something lasting and true. "You're everything to me too," she whispered against his lips. "My partner, my love, my future." Always. They stood together under the Wyoming stars, surrounded by everything they had built, and Eleanor thought about that quilt with James's name stitched lovingly into it. She had poured her secret feelings into those stitches, creating something beautiful without knowing if it would ever mean anything to anyone but her. But James had found it, had asked her to finish it, and in doing so had given her the courage to finish not just the quilt but the life she had only dreamed of. That quilt had been the beginning of everything. And standing here now, decades later, with James's arms around her and their life spread out before them in land and cattle and children and love, Eleanor knew that the best stories were the ones that started with a secret hope and ended with joy beyond imagining. Their story was exactly that kind of story, and it was far from over. The dawn of the new century in 1900 brought reflection and celebration. Joe, now 23, announced his engagement to Sarah Mitchell, daughter of a neighboring rancher. Clara, 18 and determined, had built her horse training business into one of the most respected in the state. Tommy graduated from college, and returned home full of ideas about agricultural innovation and business expansion. And Rose, 12, was already showing signs of becoming a talented artist and designer. Eleanor and James, now in their mid-40s, were still actively involved in the ranch but increasingly letting their children take leadership roles. They had earned the right to slow down slightly, to enjoy the fruits of decades of hard work. James still rode out with the hands most days, but he no longer felt the need to prove himself through sheer exhaustion. Eleanor still sewed, but now purely for pleasure or special commission pieces, no longer needing the income. Joe and Sarah's wedding in the spring of 1901 was a grand affair, held at the Cooper Ranch with guests coming from as far as Denver. Eleanor made Sarah's wedding dress, an elaborate creation of silk and lace that took months to complete. On the wedding day, as Eleanor watched her oldest son marry the woman he loved, she caught James's eye across the room and smiled. They had started this, had built the foundation that allowed Joe to have this kind of joyful beginning. Grandchildren began arriving soon after. Joe and Sarah's first child, a boy they named James after his grandfather, was born in 1902. Clara surprised everyone by falling in love with a horse trainer from Colorado who came to study her methods. And they married in 1903, settling on Cooper property in a house James built for them. Tommy, always more interested in business than romance, nonetheless met and courted a smart young woman named Elizabeth who shared his passion for agricultural innovation, and they married in 1904. By 1905, Eleanor and James had 4 grandchildren and another on the way, and the ranch had grown into one of the most successful operations in Wyoming. The original cabin where they had started their married life still stood, preserved as a reminder of where they had begun. The commemorative quilt Eleanor had made so long ago was brought out of storage in Banner Creek's town hall for a special exhibit on the town's early history, and Eleanor and James attended the opening together. They stood in front of the quilt, now faded but still beautiful, and Eleanor pointed out the square with James's name with its horses and ropes and prairie roses and stars. "That's where it started," she said softly. "With those secret stitches late at night when I didn't even know if you felt the same way." "Best secret you ever kept," James replied, pulling her close. "And I'm glad I found it when I did. I'm glad I asked you to finish it, because look at what we finished together." They looked at the quilt, at all those names stitched together into community and history. And then they looked at each other, at the life they had built that was richer and fuller than any quilt could capture. They had started with hope and hard work, with love and determination, and they had created something lasting. As they walked out of the town hall into the bright Wyoming sunshine, hands clasped together the way they had been for nearly 30 years, Eleanor felt complete. She had come west looking for independence and found partnership. She had hoped for respect and found love. She had dreamed of building something real and had created a legacy that would last generations. And it had all started with a cowboy finding her stitching his name into a quilt in secret and asking her to finish. She had finished it. They both had. And the story they had stitched together, line by line, stitch by stitch, year by year, was more beautiful than anything Eleanor could have imagined that night in 1876, when James Cooper had walked into her room and changed her life forever. Their love story had become a legend in Banner Creek, told and retold until it took on mythic proportions. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. 2 people had found each other against the odds, had chosen to build something together, and had committed to that choice every single day for decades. That was the real story. That was the real miracle. As evening fell on the Cooper Ranch in the summer of 1905, 3 generations gathered for dinner around the large table in the main house. Joe and Sarah were there with their 3 children, Clara and her husband with their baby daughter, Tommy and Elizabeth expecting their first child, Rose now 17 and full of plans for her future. The ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse, the cattle grazed peacefully, The horses moved quietly in the corral. Eleanor looked around the table at faces she loved, at the family she and James had created, at the life they had built from nothing but hope and hard work. James caught her eye and smiled, and in that smile Eleanor saw everything. Their beginning, their journey, their present, their future. After dinner, as they had done for 30 years, Eleanor and James walked out onto the porch together. The Wyoming sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, and the prairie stretched out endlessly before them, beautiful and harsh and home. "I love you," James said, as he had said thousands of times over 30 years. "I love you too," Eleanor replied, as she had replied thousands of times and would reply thousands more. They stood together under the vast sky, on land they owned, surrounded by family they had created. And Eleanor thought about that young woman who had sat in a boarding house room late at night, secretly stitching a cowboy's name into a quilt. That young woman had been brave enough to hope, foolish enough to dream, determined enough to build, and she had built everything. The stars emerged one by one overhead, the same stars that had watched them dance at that first barn dance, that had witnessed their wedding, that had shone down on every moment of their shared life. And under those stars, Eleanor and James Cooper stood together, partners in every way that mattered, grateful for the journey that had brought them here and eager for all the tomorrows still to come. Their story, stitched together one day at a time with love and labor, was complete and yet ongoing, finished and yet continuing, a testament to what two people could build when they chose each other and committed to that choice with everything they had. It was a good story. It was their story. And it was exactly the happily ever after both of them had dreamed of when James had found Eleanor stitching his name into a quilt in secret and asked her to finish. They had finished it together, and it was beautiful.